What if the best thing that ever happened to you threatened to trap you forever at 16? In February 1966, a London newspaper put a nervous schoolgirl from Neasden on a page and gave her a new name, Twiggy, the face of 66. Overnight, Leslie Hornby's life split in two. There was the girl who still had homework, two parents who worked shifts, and a bus route memorized by heart. And there was the image, cropped, retouched, renamed, that fashion seized, magnified and projected onto every surface it could find. The image did not grow up. It stayed frozen at the moment when her hair was freshly cut at Leonard's. When Barry Ledigan's lens caught her in that strange space between child and woman, the real person had to keep moving. She had to learn how to navigate New York studios and Paris runways, how to smile while talk show hosts tried to make a punchline out of her ignorance, how to hear strangers discuss whether her body was dangerous for other girls to look at. This is not just the story of how Twiggy became the first supermodel. It is the story of how Leslie Hornby eventually decided that surviving the 1960s meant doing something radical, walking away from the decade that made her, before her photograph ever hit a newsstand. Leslie's world was small and solid. Neasden was not glamorous. It was rows of houses, the rumble of buses, the smell of dinners cooked after long shifts. Her father came home with sawdust in the creases of his hands. Her mother's feet ached from standing all day. They counted pay packets, not air miles. The only spot of fantasy in her room was a pinboard where she taped cutouts from magazines. Dresses, haircuts. Shoes she knew she would never own. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see a future muse of fashion. She saw a girl whose knees knocked, whose skirts always hung a bit too loosely from her hips, who tried to disappear at the back of school photographs. The nickname Twiggy started there, at home, and it was never meant to be anything but affectionate. She was as thin as a twig. Her sisters joked, all elbows and angles, in a kitchen where humor softened everything. The word was a blanket thrown over a sore spot. It turned a worry, is she too skinny, into something everyone could laugh about. At 14, she hated her legs and her uncooperative hair, but she loved drawing dresses, copying looks from magazines onto paper, turning bodies into mannequins she could control with a pencil stroke. School gave her one more refuge. In art class, she could sit bent over a sketchbook and let the noise of the classroom blur into the background. Teachers noticed that the quiet girl in the back row had an eye for line and proportion. On the rare occasions a teacher or friend suggested she was pretty, she dismissed it instantly. To her, pretty meant soft and confident and effortless. She felt sharp and awkward and effortful. When other girls practiced walking in heels for school dances, she practiced staying out of sight. Modeling did not feature in any of the futures she could plausibly imagine. Girls like her didn't become models in the 1960s. Models were sleek, posh, and usually came from lives with front gardens and finishing schools, not backyards and bus passes. So when a friend mentioned that a woman in fashion could take a look at her, it sounded less like a real opportunity and more like a dare. She took it anyway. One cold day, she rode the bus to the other side of the city, clutching directions on a scrap of paper. The room she entered smelled of perfume and cigarettes. The woman looked up, let her eyes travel from Leslie's feet to her head, and delivered a verdict with clinical efficiency. Too short. Much too slim. Fine for a girl, wrong for a model. It wasn't cruelty, just industry logic. But to a 15-year-old carrying every insecurity on the surface of her skin, it landed like a sentence. And on the way back, the bus window blurred as tears collected. The city outside looked distant, like a place where other people's lives happened. What she almost missed in that blur was the one small opening left in the woman's words. Your body won't get you in. She had said, Your face might. She had suggested a few test shots. Almost as an afterthought, a few weeks later, Leslie found herself in front of Barry Ladigan's camera in a modest studio, wearing ordinary clothes while the light was anything but ordinary. Under his lens, the features she had learned to apologize for, the oversized eyes, the sharp jaw, the tiny frame, rearranged themselves into something graphic and striking. He asked her to look straight down the lens. No smiles. No trying to be pretty. The shutter clicked on a new version of her that she had never seen. Those photographs ended up propped against a wall in House of Leonard, a Mayfair salon where women with money came to buy new selves by the inch. For a Neasden schoolgirl, even sitting in Leonard's chair felt like trespassing. The salon hummed with the low, confident murmur of a world she did not speak the language of. Leonard studied the photographs. Then the girl. And then the photographs again. He saw not just hair to be trimmed, but a headline waiting to happen. He cut her hair close, exposing the line of her neck, leaving long pieces at the front that exaggerated the width of her eyes. It was not the kind of cut designed to make a boyfriend happy or a parent relieved. It was the kind that made a photographer lean forward. Ladigan shot her again immediately, the new crop transforming her face from thin girl to something almost cartoonishly modern. When Leonard taped those pictures in his salon window, he wasn't just advertising his skills. He was sending up a flare that said, "The future looks like this." Deirdre McSherry, fashion journalist for the Daily Express, saw the flare passing by. She stopped, doubled back, and walked into the salon to ask the most important question of Leslie's life. Who is that? Within days, there was an interview, a photo shoot, and then a front page. The nickname that had once bounced around a crowded kitchen now sat in ink above her newly cropped head. Twiggy, the face of 66. That headline did more than introduce a girl. It declared a symbol. It told an entire country that if they wanted to know what 1966 looked like, they should look at her. The effect on her real life was immediate and disorienting. The same house in Neasden. The same cramped room. The same walk to the bus stop, but inside, the phone had become a machine that rang for Twiggy. Photographers called. Ad agencies called. People who had never set foot in Neasden before now asked to speak to it like a person. Leslie still had school to finish. She still had homework. Teachers. And the quiet panic of exams. She also now had a boyfriend, Justin de Villeneuve, who understood the glamour and danger in this sudden attention, where her parents heard confusion. He heard opportunity and stepped into the gap as self-appointed manager. He took the calls, set the prices, negotiated the shoots. To some, he would later look like a Svengali. To a 16-year-old trying not to drown, he looked like someone willing to stand between her and the rush. In the studio, the transformation was swift and ruthless. Makeup artists thickened her lashes into graphic spikes, painting her lower lids with drawn-on lashes that made her eyes almost alien. Stylists put her in shift dresses that fell straight from her shoulders, erasing any lingering softness on contact sheets. She seemed made of lines, eyeliner, hemline, jawline, all slicing against blank backgrounds. Her small frame, once the reason she'd been told no, became the very thing that made her photographs impossible to confuse with anyone else's. London was ready for her. The city was in the middle of its own adolescence. Music, art, hemlines, attitudes. Everything was rising and speeding up at once. Mary Quant's miniskirts were marching down King's Road. Bands from northern towns were storming the charts. teenagers were suddenly a market, not just an age bracket. Into that restless energy stepped a girl who looked like the revolution shrunk down and made wearable. Her rise dovetailed so neatly with the story London wanted to tell about itself that people tended to forget there was no master plan behind it. She did not wake up one morning and decide to become the face of 66. That role was assigned to her by editors and advertisers who needed a single pair of eyes to put on the cover of a story about a generation. To them, her body was not a person with a history, it was shorthand. From the beginning, the fascination with her body carried a second edge. The same press that turned her into a sensation also turned her into a problem to be discussed. Articles marveled at her 31, 22, 32 measurements, printed her weight as if it were a stock price. Doctors were quoted worrying that girls might starve themselves to copy her. Commentators used her photograph as an illustration for hand-wringing about anorexia, even though nobody asking those questions had ever seen her plate at home. She and her mother protested in interviews that she ate heartily, that she had always been slight. It didn't matter. The narrative had shifted. The girl in the photographs had stopped belonging to herself and belonged instead to a culture looking for an easy symbol in a complicated conversation about women's bodies. Every time she walked onto a set, she brought not only her own insecurities, but the weight of other people's arguments. The strangest part was watching a private nickname become a public weapon. At home, Twiggy had once meant affection, a way of teasing a child into eating another roast potato. In headlines, it became a diagnosis, a banner for the Twiggy look that diet companies and critics alike could point to. She would open a paper and see the word that had once made her laugh, used to argue that an entire generation of girls was in danger. Nobody asked whether the girl carrying that nickname wanted to be responsible for all of that. When Diana Vreeland saw her, she didn't see a problem. She saw a solution to a question Vogue had not quite known how to phrase. What does the new decade look like? Not like the voluptuous movie goddesses of the 1950s. Not like carefully groomed society ladies. It looked like speed. Youth. Rebellion. And a certain androgyny. Twiggy, with her boyish frame and enormous eyes. Was all of those ideas in one silhouetted shape. Vreeland summoned her to New York. For Leslie. The journey began like any other. A suitcase packed by her mother. Instructions not to forget to call. A nervous goodbye at the airport. For the cameras waiting at the other end. Her arrival was an event. Bert Stern filmed her stepping into the terminal as if she were part of the British invasion. Another export like the Beatles, only thinner and quieter. On that first trip, she was greeted not like a model heading to work, but like a movie star. Strangers shouted her name, asked her to turn just so they could see the real-life version of the face they had met in newsprint. In New York studios, the machinery of image-making was even bigger. Richard Avedon stripped away everything but her and his light. In his hands, her face became almost abstract. Stark, sharp, with eyes that seemed to hover separate from the rest of her body. Melvin Sokolsky did the opposite, dragging her out into the streets, setting this strange, fragile-looking creature against steel beams and busy sidewalks. Everywhere they went, crowds formed, clogging the backgrounds and threatening to swallow her whole. Sokolsky's solution was both practical and horrifyingly symbolic. He printed masks of her face and handed them to the onlookers so that, on film, the crowd itself became an extension of her. The resulting images are almost absurd. One real Twiggy standing in a sea of flat, cardboard Twiggies. Behind the clever concept lay a blunt truth. The more the world multiplied her image, the less space there was for her to be a person inside it. If the still cameras wanted perfection, Television wanted something messier. Producers booked her not just to admire her, but to prod at her. They were fascinated by the gap between the worldwide icon and the actual teenager from a working-class family who had left school early. The easiest way to expose that gap was to ask questions carefully designed to make her seem small. On one American program, she walked on expecting to talk about clothes and music. Instead, she found herself across from Woody Allen, who started firing questions about philosophy and politics in a tone that suggested the whole point was to highlight what she didn't know. As you can see in the surviving footage, the precise moment when she realizes she is not meant to answer well. Her shoulders tighten. Her smile goes from natural to fixed. The audience laughs along with the host as he turns a 16-year-old's limited education into a comedy routine. She did not storm off. She did not lecture anybody on respect. She did what girls in her position were expected to do. Laughed when cued. Shrugged off the barbs. Tried to look unbothered. Decades later, she would look at those tapes and say, with characteristic understatement, that you could never get away with that now. At the time, there was no vocabulary for what was happening. There was only the sense that, along with her face, her embarrassment was also part of the public entertainment. Those shows left a residue after a day's work. When the makeup was off and the wig removed, she would replay the conversations in her head and feel a familiar burn of shame. Not because she had been stupid, she was not, but because she had been set up to fail in front of millions and had gamely walked into the trap. The next morning, she would be driven to a studio where people fussed over the tilt of her head as if nothing had happened. The disconnect between how much the world cared about the angle of her eyeliner and how little it cared about her humiliation was its own kind of education. Behind the scenes, the glamour was shot through with a more ordinary exhaustion. There were 5 call times, makeup chairs that seemed to swallow hours whole, flights that blurred time zones until she no longer knew which city she was being told was the most important. She lived out of suitcases and garment bags, her own clothes disappearing under a uniform of borrowed outfits. The compliments and criticisms blurred together until they were just different tones of noise. One day she would be celebrated in headlines as the perfect embodiment of modernity. The next, an older man in a newspaper would declare that her appearance was a danger to girls everywhere. On rare, quiet nights in anonymous hotel rooms, she phoned home and listened to her mother talk about ordinary things. Neighbors, the price of groceries, a cousin's new baby. The normality steadied her. Then the next morning she would open a paper and see her own face huge on the front, attached to debates about morality and health. Leslie's life was still threaded through with these small, domestic conversations. Twiggy's life, the one everyone thought they knew, consisted entirely of arguments conducted between people who did not know her at all. Through all of it, Leslie remained younger than most of the people telling her what she meant. She went home between trips to the same house, the same parents, the same kettle boiling on the same stove. They were proud, bewildered, and occasionally frightened by the attention swirling around their middle daughter. They watched strangers argue on television about her body and wondered why nobody who cared so much about their child's health had ever bothered to knock on the door and meet her. As the 60s rushed on, the gap between Twiggy and Leslie stopped being just a feeling and turned into a daily negotiation. The image on magazine covers remained frozen in 1966. The long lashes, the super short skirts, the unlined face, the woman inside those photographs, however, was aging. Learning. Wanting things the image could not accommodate. Turning 19. 20. 21. She felt expectation hardening around her, the assumption that she would stay forever the face of 66. Even as the calendar flipped past the end of the decade she supposedly defined, what saved her from being trapped there was not a scandal, but a curiosity. On sets, she found herself watching what happened when the camera wasn't pointed at her. Choreographers marked out steps. Dancers repeated combinations until they were second nature. Actors made choices about lines and pauses that changed the entire mood of a scene. She was fascinated by the construction of performance, by the way a story could be built and taken apart. Being told to stand still while other people did all that work began to feel less like a privilege, and more like standing just outside a window. Was our looking in? Ken Russell's offer to cast her in The Boyfriend arrived into that restlessness. To many, it sounded like a stunt. Campy director hires famous model. To him, it was an artistic decision. He had seen her in movement, understood that there was an instinct there he could shape. He offered her the lead in a big, lavish musical that would require her to sing, dance, and carry a film. The fear was immediate and huge. She had never trained properly in any of those disciplines. Modeling had taught her how to hold herself, where the light was, when to move. It had not prepared her to remember choreography or sustain a scene across multiple takes. Saying yes meant risks that went far beyond a bad review. If she failed loudly enough, it would confirm every suspicion that she had been nothing but a haircut and a lucky headline. Yeah, she said yes anyway. What followed was hard. Disciplined work that ran directly counter to the myth of Twiggy as an accidental star. There were hours in dance studios sweating over tap routines, voice lessons that pushed her range and stamina, acting classes where she was asked to access parts of herself nobody had cared about in a fashion shoot. For the first time, her success would depend not on the accident of her bone structure, but on skills she could actively build. On set, surrounded by veteran performers and technicians, she experienced a different kind of scrutiny. People still looked at her, but now they were measuring whether she could hit a note, find a beat, land a joke. When she flubbed a line, there was no editor to slice the mistake out of the negative. She had to start again, find the truth of the moment, and keep going. It was frightening and exhilarating in equal measure. When The Boyfriend premiered in 1971, critics came ready to be unimpressed. Instead, they watched a young woman who could hold the center of the frame for reasons other than novelty. She was witty, touching, able to shift from wide-eyed innocence to knowingness. The Golden Globes that followed did not erase the years she had spent being spoken over and spoken about, but they did something just as important. They proved to her that she could be more than the photograph that had launched her. At the moment when most people expected her to cash in harder than ever on her modeling fame, she stepped sideways. Around 21, she stopped taking fashion bookings in any serious way. No farewell tour, no melodrama, just a quiet refusal to keep being dressed and undressed for other people's visions. Asked about it later, she summed up the decision in one line that has followed her ever since. You can't be a clothes hanger all your life. That sentence sounds lighthearted. Underneath is a brutal assessment of what modeling had been for her. A job in which her personality, intelligence, and desires were routinely hung up in the wardrobe with the clothes. Walking away meant turning down money, visibility, and a kind of immortality. It also meant reclaiming time, agency, and the right to grow older without being compared, every day, to a 16-year-old frozen on a page. The years that followed did not have the same searing, iconic images, and that was the point. On stage in My One and Only on Broadway, she danced and sang her way into 8 shows a week. the applause coming at the end of real labor rather than at the flash of a shutter. The Tony nomination that greeted her performance was another quiet rewiring of her identity. In the program, she might still be billed as Twiggy, but the respect attached to her name was no longer only about what she looked like. Her personal life was not free of pain. Her first marriage, to actor Michael Whitney, ended abruptly with his early death, leaving her to navigate grief and single motherhood while still living in a culture that insisted on seeing her as perpetually young. Perpetually light. Later, with actor Lee Lawson, she built a more stable partnership, a family that was neither fairy tale nor tragedy, just the complicated, ongoing work of two people making a life together. In interviews, she spoke about these things without drama, grounding her story in the same ordinariness that had always existed beneath the extraordinary headlines. As decades turned, the world kept pulling her image out of its archives. Designers cited her in mood boards. Stylists referenced her in shoots with new girls who had not even been born when she first appeared in print. She agreed to some projects and declined others. She put her name on clothing lines, appeared on television as a judge and host, allowed the Twiggy brand to keep breathing, but always at a distance she could control. She laughed about the old photographs, pointed out how strange some of the makeup now looked, and refused to pretend that being the face of 66 had been anything other than both a blessing and a weight. Watching old clips of herself being grilled about her body or mocked for her education, she did something few icons manage. She admitted how wrong it all looked. She noted how differently a 16-year-old would be treated in a studio today. How some of the comments that slid past censors then would cause outrage now. There was no bitterness in the way she said it, just a clear-eyed acknowledgement that history had moved. The irony was that history never moved past the photograph. In every new documentary about the 1960s, the same imagery appeared. The close crop, the lashes, the chidom, the stare. It sold nostalgia and clothes and a certain idea of youth. The difference now was that the woman behind it no longer needed to live inside it. She could visit that moment, talk about it, appreciate what it had given her, and then go home to a garden, a kitchen, a life where nobody expected her to remain perpetually half-child, half-woman, in an age where almost everyone is encouraged to create their own version of Twiggy, a single, perfect image to represent them online, a brand to be consistent, a persona to be maintained. Her story reads like a quiet act of rebellion. The best thing that ever happened to her really did threaten to trap her forever at 16. The newspapers, the designers, the directors all had an interest in keeping her there. She took what she needed from that moment and then did the unglamorous, even difficult thing. She stepped out of it. She chose to let the image stay young while she grew older. Stranger. Deeper. She allowed the world to keep loving Twiggy while insisting, gently but firmly, on living as Leslie. Some people spend their entire lives trying to become an image that will outlive them. She spent hers making sure an image that outlived its decade did not swallow the rest of her story. And if even the face of 66 had to fight that hard not to be trapped inside a single photograph, it raises a question that belongs less to the 60s and more to now. In a culture where we build and curate our own frozen versions of ourselves every day, how many of us will recognize the moment when the image stops serving the person? And how many will be brave enough, as she was, to walk away from the thing that made us before it finishes deciding who we are allowed to be?